Hello, sword friends. I'm here with another review, and what a beautiful sword I have to review. This one is made by swordmaker LK Chen, and it's a reproduction of a very specific sword, a famous sword in a museum. This is called the Majestic HuangTaiji Yaodao. That means the Yaodao, or waist saber, of HuangTaiji. Now, who is HuangTaiji? So, for the quick history lesson, this is the saber at the union of three different cultures. HuangTaiji was the first emperor of the Qing dynasty of China. He also goes by the name of Emperor Taizong. So he took on a throne name. There's usually several names associated with each emperor, but the founder of the Qing dynasty. So originally a Jurchen, the Jurchen people were existed to the north in what would be called Manchuria nowadays. And similar to the Mongols, they weren't quite as nomadic as the Mongols under Genghis Khan. They are more of a semi-nomadic people, and they were vassals of the Han Chinese during the Ming Dynasty. And the very famous leader, Nurhaci, decided to unify all of the people groups, so many different ethnic groups. He even allied with the Mongols and eventually rebelled against Ming China. So it took a period of multiple decades, and while Nurhaci did not survive to see his war against the Chinese to completion, one of his, several of his sons were successors, and one of his sons was HuangTaiji. And so he became the first emperor of the newfound dynasty. He renamed the Jurchen people the Manchu people, and the Manchu dynasty became the Qing dynasty of China. So this saber here would probably be considered a Manchu saber, and it shows the transition from Ming. So we have some of the arabesque work that you would find stylistically much more commonly in the Ming dynasty than in the Qing dynasty, but we're already starting to see things that are characteristic of the Qing, where we have the more squared off guard, the type of scabbard slide, and the overall configuration of the scabbard. The kind of angular fittings are still more of a Ming design, but the stylistic elements are no longer in the Ming. The style of dragons that we have here are characteristic of Manchu. So this is very interesting. It's simultaneously showing Ming, Manchu, and then later what will be established as Qing Chinese motifs all together in this one sword. Originally, it probably was done in iron with gold over it. I don't know that for sure. Today, it's done in brass. And notably, it has this very shiny peen block on the end. And some may say, oh, why would they stand it out like that? This is actually original to how the sword is. If you go and look in the museum, the tang comes out and then is rounded over to look almost like a pearl sticking out of the end of the sword. So this was reproduced very faithfully. There's going to be very little that I can say negatively about this sword. So the only negative thing that I'll say right off the bat, although everything is executed to a very high degree, again, considering the price point, this level of detail is often on a sword, more than $1,000. And while this sword is a little bit expensive for LK Chen's usual price point, it's still quite a bargain for how much sword you're getting. That said, the scabbard here, while gorgeous, is a bit thick. So I'll turn it like this so that the camera can see. And you can see just how wide the end is. On antique originals, the scabbards are usually quite thin, not very much more than the width of the original blade. So this here is probably 2.7, maybe 3 centimeters or more across. I'd like to see that come down maybe by 40% or so in the end. But that's probably the only complaint. I'm going to pull this out and we'll take a look at the beautiful blade. So this is just a gorgeous blade. I'm just going to wipe it down for a second so that I can see it. And you'll notice immediately what stands out is this brightly contrasted fuller. So they've lacquered the fuller here. Originally, it would have been done using a very highly, probably toxic dye, something like cinnabar. Hopefully they use a more conventional, modern dye that's not going to hurt anyone in the production process. But this is something that we see on blades even as far back as the Ming for sure. Any Japanese collector is familiar with seeing this on Japanese swords, but this is something that is done on Chinese blades as well. So it has two beautiful fullers, one of which stops right here, just before a false edge. The false edge is not sharpened. It comes to a fine point, but it doesn't have a final apex on it, so you can't injure yourself on it. This particular example that I have received is San Mei produced. So it has a folded, it is of laminate construction. There is a inner piece of steel that is of harder tempering. It's a harder piece of more brittle steel surrounded by softer types of steel, which means that the edge that sticks out is going to be of is going to be able to hold a harder, keener edge while surrounded by more shock-resistant side. The casting is all very well done. I know that LK Chen has spent a lot of time trying to secure workshops to be able to execute on the intricate levels of 3D modeling that he does. So the Husho here displays the two dragons chasing, instead of a pearl this time, it looks like a heart. I don't actually recognize what design that is. The ferrules here are asymmetrical, and the same is true about the pommel here, which has a stylized, I believe it's a dragon here. It may be some other creature from Chinese mythology. Another thing that I really need to show off is how beautiful this grip is. So the grips, which look quite blocky this way, actually have been slimmed quite a bit this way and are not quite uniform. So it flares at the top end and it tapers on the finger end so that it fits very ergonomically even in my rather large hands. And this is an improvement over the previous design. So if I bring over my one of my previous favorite swords, the Yaodao, you can see that the Yaodao is significantly thicker. This is much more conventional for what you find on production swords, Chinese swords, but it is not what is typical on original antiques. This is much more typical of the type of width that you find on original, especially Qing period waist sabers. Now, what about the blade? So even though I called it a Yaodao, Yaodao doesn't refer to the type of blade you have. You can have almost any shape of blade. And if you're carrying it as a military saber at your waist, you still call it Yaodao. It just means it's your sidearm, essentially. So you could have it with a big, series of clips here at the end. You could have it with a slab tip. You could have it very heavily curved. You could have it almost straight. This one is basically almost straight, and then it just gently curves at the edge with a nice pointy tip. This one would usually be called a goose quill saber. Now, previously, I've reviewed the Taiyan Yangling Dao, which is a Ming period, a very late Ming period design. And a lot of people say, oh, they just took the blade from the Taiyan Yangling Dao and stuck it on the Majestic, and they just stuck it on the new imperial sword. But you can see if I put them together, there is a significant difference in size. This is a much larger sword, and even though it is substantial, it still balances quite nicely in the hand. And this is something else that I would probably want to address. So I'll show the dynamics of the sword. It balances about 14 or so centimeters in front of the guard, which isn't terrible. That is consistent with historical Dao, with historical Pei Dao. But given exactly how large this blade is, it's possible that the original antique would balance even further out. And that may be in part due to how thick the casting elements are. I don't know that for sure. Without studying the original, that would be hard to say. But as another point of improvement, LK Chen could probably try to reduce some of the weight of the fittings that he's putting on his swords, because I think that the blades in general are very, very well made and well proportioned. They tend to start off from the correct thickness. They tend to exhibit the correct amount of distal taper. But the point of balances tend to be a little too close to the hilt and probably need to be a little bit further out. That won't change the handling characteristics as much as you think, because the total weight of the sword is not going to change that much. And you can still have a very light and maneuverable sword while having a little bit more blade presence if you keep the balance a little bit further out away from the grip. A lot of people get caught up on having a point of balance very, very close to the hand, but in the originals that we're studying, from the data that myself and the Scholar General have studied, it's very common for Dao to have point of balances between, 14 and 20 centimeters away from the guard. That's very rare to find on reproduction swords. That said, this one does fall within the range of antique originals, and even though it's a big and powerful sword, you can still catch and redirect it very nicely. So, shall we see how it performs? Let's take a quick look. So it's very easy to say that this is one of the sharpest swords that I have ever had the pleasure of working with. The edge on it is absolutely fearsome, but it's also beautiful. So this is a wonderful union between both form and function, and really it represents an amazing point in Chinese history. LK Chen has really knocked it out of the park with this one. And I think that this is an example of one of the kind of higher end swords that he has elected to start working with, which is fine. In general, I think that LK Chen prefers to produce kind of run-of-the-mill trooper swords, which is good. I think that if you're going to talk about how swords were used in military conflict, in military combat, having a sword that was used by the line troopers is perhaps most useful in order to figure out how they were used throughout history. Now, that said, in addition to having these kind of typical run-of-the-mill swords, once in a while, it's nice to produce something that's really impressive, really high-end, and looks great on the wall and is representing an important point of history, like the change from one dynastic period to another dynastic period. So thank you very much, LK Chen, for making sure that this came to me. This is not going to stay with me. This will be going on to someone else for a review. So we won't do any more extensive testing with it, but it's great to have a look at it, and I think it's gorgeous. If this sort of sword appeals to you, I can easily say that this is a great one to pick up. So please make sure you take a keen look at the Majestic HuangTaiji Yaodao from LK Chen. Take care.